The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and orange as Jake Martinez checked the fence line on his family's cattle ranch. He had been working this land for 37 years, ever since his father passed and left him the sprawling property that stretched across 3,000 acres of rugged terrain. The familiar sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and the gentle whisper of wind through the mesquite trees created a peaceful symphony that Jake had grown to love. At 52, Jake was a man shaped by the harsh beauty of the desert. His weathered hands told stories of countless hours spent mending fences, birthing calves, and fighting the elements to keep his livelihood intact. His wife Sarah often joked that he had more conversations with his cattle than he did with people, and she wasn't entirely wrong. The isolation of ranch life suited Jake perfectly. He preferred the honest company of animals to the complicated world of human relationships. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Jake loaded his pickup truck with fence posts, wire, and tools before heading out to repair a section damaged by the recent monsoon rains. The storm had been particularly fierce, leaving several areas of the property in need of attention. As he drove along the dusty ranch road, he noticed fresh tire tracks that didn't belong to any of his vehicles. This wasn't entirely unusual, as occasionally hunters or hikers would venture onto the property despite the clearly posted signs. The damaged fence was located in one of the more remote sections of the ranch, near a series of rocky outcroppings that provided natural shelter for wildlife. Jake had always been cautious about this area, knowing that mountain lions and other predators sometimes used the caves for denning. He kept his rifle in the truck and his grandfather's hunting knife on his belt, not out of paranoia, but from a lifetime of respect for the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. As Jake worked under the climbing sun, sweat beading on his forehead, he became aware of an unusual sound carried on the desert wind. It was faint at first, almost like the cry of a hawk or coyote, but something about it made him pause in his work. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and listened more carefully. The sound came again, and this time Jake's blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal at all. Someone was screaming. Jake dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. The screaming grew louder and more desperate as he approached a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards from where he had been working. His heart pounded as he recognized the unmistakable terror in the voice. It was a woman, and she was in serious trouble. "Help me, please." The words echoed off the rock walls, filled with such raw fear that Jake felt his stomach clench. He had heard similar cries before, usually from cattle caught in wire or attacked by predators, but this was different. This was human desperation in its purest form. Jake rounded the largest boulder and stopped short. The scene before him was unlike anything he had encountered in his decades on the ranch. A young woman, probably in her 20s, was pressed against the rock wall, her clothes torn and dirty, her dark hair matted with dust and what looked like blood. But it wasn't her condition that made Jake freeze in place. It was what stood between him and the woman. 3 men faced the woman, their backs to Jake. They wore dirty clothes and had the lean, desperate look of people who had been living rough for some time. One held a length of rope. Another clutched a backpack that appeared to be stuffed with supplies, and the third man held something in his hand that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. It was a gun pointed directly at the terrified woman. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt, the familiar weight of the handle providing some comfort in the surreal situation. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Were these men lost hikers who had somehow gotten into a confrontation? Criminals hiding on his property? Drug runners using his remote ranch as a route? The woman's eyes met his over the shoulder of one of the men, and Jake saw a flicker of hope mixed with terror. She was young, Hispanic, with intelligent eyes that seemed to be silently pleading with him to do something, anything to help her. Her lips were cracked and dry, suggesting she had been without water for some time, and Jake could see scratches and bruises on her exposed arms. "Please," she whispered again, this time looking directly at Jake, though the men hadn't yet noticed his presence. Jake's mind flashed to his daughter Maria, who was about the same age as this woman. Maria was safely away at college in Phoenix, but seeing this young woman in such obvious danger triggered every protective instinct he possessed. He thought about Sarah, who would be expecting him home for lunch in a few hours, and wondered if he would live to see her again. The largest of the 3 men turned slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of his profile. The man's face was sunburned and scarred, with cold eyes that spoke of violence and desperation. Jake realized these weren't lost hikers or confused trespassers. These were dangerous men, and this woman was their victim. Jake's hand tightened on his knife handle as he tried to decide on his next move. He was outnumbered 3-1, and at least one of them was armed with a gun. His rifle was back at the truck, too far away to be of any immediate help. But he couldn't just walk away and leave this woman to whatever fate these men had planned for her. The bosom desert silence was broken only by the woman's quiet sobbing and the low murmur of the men's voices as they discussed something Jake couldn't quite hear. He knew he had only moments to act before they noticed him, and whatever decision he made would determine not only his fate, but the fate of the young woman who had looked at him with such desperate hope. Jake Martinez had always been a man of action rather than words, shaped by a lifetime of making quick decisions in challenging situations. As he stood hidden behind the boulder, his knife ready in his hand, he knew that the next few minutes would test everything he had learned about courage, survival, and what it truly meant to be a good man in a harsh world. Jake took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the boulder, his knife held low but ready. "Let her go," he said in a voice that carried the authority of a man who had faced down charging bulls in desert storms. The three men spun around, startled by his sudden appearance. The one with the gun immediately swung the weapon toward Jake, while the others stepped back, creating a semicircle that trapped both Jake and the woman against the rocks. Well, said the man with the gun, a thin smile playing across his weathered face. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero, boys." He was clearly the leader, standing with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others. "You picked the wrong day to play cowboy, old man." Jake studied the three men carefully, his years of reading livestock and predators serving him well in assessing human threats. The leader was dangerous but cocky, the type who relied on fear and weapons rather than skill. The man with the rope looked nervous, constantly glancing between Jake and his leader, while the third man seemed more interested in whatever was in the backpack than the confrontation unfolding around him. "This is my land," Jake said calmly, never taking his eyes off the gun barrel pointed at his chest. "You're trespassing, and it looks like you're doing a lot more than just passing through." The woman pressed herself harder against the rock wall, her eyes darting between Jake and her captors. She appeared to be trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could somehow disappear into the stone behind her. Jake noticed she was wearing the remnants of what had once been nice clothes, a blue dress that was now torn and stained with dirt and blood. "Your land?" The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding rocks. "Well, isn't that convenient? Means nobody's going to come looking for you when you disappear." Jake's grip tightened on his knife handle, but he kept his voice steady. "My wife knows where I am. She'll send people if I don't come home." "That's assuming you got a home to go back to," the man with the rope said, speaking for the first time. His voice carried an accent Jake couldn't quite place, but there was something in his tone that suggested these men had done this before. The woman suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for Jake to understand. "They killed my family," she said, her eyes fixed on Jake's face. "In Mexico. They brought me here." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. Human trafficking. He had heard about it on the news, read about the horrible things that happened to people trying to cross the border, but he had never imagined he would find himself face to face with it on his own property. "Shut up," the leader snapped at the woman, then turned back to Jake. "See, now you know too much, cowboy. Can't let you walk away from this." Jake realized that the situation was even worse than he had initially thought. These weren't just criminals hiding on his land. They were part of something much larger and more dangerous. The woman wasn't just a random victim. She was being transported somewhere against her will, and he had stumbled into the middle of an operation that probably involved more people than just these three men. "How many others?" Jake asked, surprising the men with his question. "What?" The leader seemed confused by the change in direction. "How many other people are you moving? How many others like her?" The man with the backpack looked up sharply, and Jake saw fear flash across his face. "Miguel, we need to go," he said urgently. "The others will be wondering where we are." So there were others. Jake filed that information away as he continued to assess his options. His truck was 50 yards away with his rifle locked in the gun rack. The woman appeared weak from hunger and thirst, which would slow them down if they tried to run. The three men were spread out enough that he couldn't watch all of them at once. "You're not going anywhere," Miguel said, keeping the gun trained on Jake. "Tony, tie up our new friend here. Looks like we got ourselves a bonus." The man with the rope, apparently named Tony, moved toward Jake with obvious reluctance. Jake could see the hesitation in his movements, the way he kept glancing at the gun in Miguel's hands as if he were more afraid of his leader than he was of Jake. "Don't do this," Jake said, speaking directly to Tony. "Whatever you're involved in, it doesn't have to end this way. Let the woman go, take whatever you need from my truck, and leave. I won't follow you." Tony stopped, clearly torn between his fear of Miguel and something Jake had said that resonated with him. For a moment, the desert was silent except for the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "He's lying," Miguel said, his voice harder now. "Tie him up, Tony. We'll deal with both of them when we get to the meeting point." The woman chose that moment to make her move. With a sudden burst of energy that surprised everyone, she lunged sideways and grabbed a piece of broken rock from the ground. Before anyone could react, she hurled it at Miguel's gun hand with remarkable accuracy. Miguel cursed and stumbled backward as the rock struck his wrist, causing him to momentarily lose his grip on the weapon. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He launched himself forward, his knife leading the way, as the woman scrambled behind another boulder. What followed was a desperate struggle that seemed to last forever, but probably took less than 30 seconds. Jake grappled with Miguel for control of the gun, while Tony and the third man shouted conflicting instructions at each other. The weapon went off once, the sound echoing across the desert like thunder, sending a flock of birds exploding from a nearby mesquite tree. Jake managed to knock the gun from Miguel's hand, but the younger man was stronger and more desperate. They rolled across the rocky ground, each trying to gain an advantage, while Jake fought to keep his knife from being turned against him. He could hear the woman screaming again, but this time it sounded different, more like encouragement than terror. Finally, Jake managed to pin Miguel's arm behind his back and press the knife blade against the man's throat. "Call off your friends," he panted, blood trickling from a cut above his eye where Miguel's elbow had connected. Miguel laughed, even with the knife at his throat. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've stumbled into, cowboy. There are more of us coming, and when they find out what happened here..." Jake pressed the blade a little harder against Miguel's skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "Then I guess we better make sure they don't find out." The standoff lasted only seconds before Tony made an unexpected decision that changed everything. Instead of helping his leader, he threw down the rope and raised his hands in surrender. "I'm done with this," Tony said, his voice shaking. "I never signed up for killing people on American soil." The third man, still clutching the backpack, looked back and forth between his captured leader and Tony's surrender with growing panic. "You idiots don't understand," he said, his voice rising to almost a shriek. "If we don't deliver her to the meeting point, they'll kill all of us. Our families too." Jake kept his knife pressed against Miguel's throat while trying to process this new information. The situation was more complex than he had realized, involving not just these three men but an entire network of criminals who used fear and violence to control their operations. "What's your name?" Jake asked the woman who had emerged from behind the boulder and was watching the scene with wide, fearful eyes. "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Vasquez. Elena, can you get to my truck? The keys are in the ignition." She nodded and began moving carefully around the group of men, staying as far away from them as possible. Jake noticed she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention to herself, probably through terrible experience. "You're making a huge mistake," Miguel said through gritted teeth. "The people we work for don't forgive and they don't forget. They have eyes everywhere, even in small towns like yours." Jake had lived in rural Arizona long enough to know that criminal organizations often used remote areas for their operations, but he had never imagined his own ranch could become involved. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and the closest town was a 40-minute drive on good roads. "Who are they?" Jake asked, pressing for information while he still had the advantage. Miguel laughed bitterly. "You really want to know? They call themselves Los Hermanos del Desierto, the Desert Brothers. They move people, drugs, money, whatever pays well, and they don't like witnesses." Tony shifted nervously, casting glances toward the desert as if expecting armed men to appear at any moment. "Miguel, shut up. You're making it worse for all of us." "Worse?" Miguel's voice rose to a shout. "Look around, Tony. It's already as bad as it can get." Elena had reached the truck and was climbing into the driver's seat. Jake could see her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. but she managed to start the engine. The sound of the truck rumbling to life seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The man with the backpack suddenly made a break for it, running toward a cluster of rocks about 100 yards away. Jake watched him go but didn't pursue, keeping his focus on Miguel and Tony. He suspected the backpack contained something important, possibly money or communication equipment, but his priority was securing the immediate threat. "Let me up," Miguel said. "My arm's going numb." "Not until you answer some questions," Jake replied. "How many others are coming? When are they supposed to meet you?" Miguel remained silent, but Tony looked like he was ready to talk. The man was clearly terrified, sweat beading on his forehead despite the relatively cool morning air. "Tony," Jake said, making his voice as reasonable as possible, "you said you didn't sign up for this. Help me understand what's really going on here." Tony glanced nervously at Miguel, then back at Jake. "There are supposed to be 8 women total. Elena was the last pickup before we headed to the transfer point. There are 3 other teams like us, each responsible for different routes." "Transfer point?" "It's a warehouse about 30 miles north of here near the interstate. That's where they load them into trucks for transport to different cities." Jake felt sick. Elena wasn't just one victim. She was part of a larger operation that was destroying multiple lives. The scope of what he had stumbled into was overwhelming. Elena honked the truck horn twice, a sharp sound that cut through the desert air. Jake looked over and saw her pointing frantically toward the south, where a dust cloud was rising from the direction of the main ranch road. "Company's coming," Miguel said with satisfaction. "Told you they'd be looking for us." Jake could see a vehicle approaching in the distance, moving fast and heading directly toward their location. His mind raced through the possibilities. It could be Sarah, worried because he hadn't returned for lunch. It could be one of his neighbors checking on the storm damage, or it could be more members of the criminal organization that Miguel had mentioned. "Elena," Jake shouted. "Drive toward the house. Get help." But Elena either didn't hear him or was too frightened to move, because the truck remained where it was, engine running but going nowhere. Tony was becoming more agitated by the second. "If that's Carlos and his team, we're all dead," he said. "Carlos doesn't leave witnesses, ever." "Who's Carlos?" Jake demanded. "Miguel's cousin. He's the enforcer for this region. Makes Miguel look like a Sunday school teacher." Jake felt the gravity of the situation settling on him like a physical weight. He was a rancher, not a fighter, and he was rapidly getting in over his head. But looking at Elena's terrified face in the truck, he knew he couldn't abandon her to whatever fate awaited her at the hands of these criminals. The approaching vehicle was close enough now that Jake could see. It was a large SUV with tinted windows. Exactly the type of vehicle someone would use for illegal transportation. It was moving with purpose, following the tire tracks that Jake had noticed earlier that morning. "Make a choice, cowboy," Miguel said. "Let me go now and maybe Carlos will let you live. Keep holding that knife to my throat and I guarantee you'll regret it." Jake looked at Elena, then at Tony, who was clearly struggling with his own moral dilemma. The approaching SUV was less than a quarter mile away and closing fast. "Tony," Jake said urgently, "if you really want out of this, now's your chance to prove it. Help me get that woman to safety." Tony stared at Jake for a long moment, then at the approaching vehicle, then back at Elena in the truck. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jake saw something other than fear in the man's eyes. He saw the possibility of redemption. Tony made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. Instead of waiting for the approaching SUV, he sprinted toward Jake's truck where Elena sat frozen behind the wheel. "Move over," Tony shouted as he reached the driver's side door. "I know these roads better than you." Elena hesitated for a moment, then slid across to the passenger seat as Tony jumped behind the wheel. The truck lurched forward as he gunned the engine, heading not toward the main ranch road where the SUV was approaching, but toward a narrow cattle trail that wound through the rocky terrain. Jake was left holding Miguel with one arm, while watching his truck disappear into the desert landscape. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now depending on one criminal to save Elena from other criminals, while he remained trapped with the most dangerous one. "Well, that was unexpected," Miguel said with what sounded almost like admiration. "Tony never struck me as the heroic type." The approaching SUV had reached the area where Jake's truck had been parked and came to a sliding stop. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, all carrying weapons that made Jake's knife seem pitifully inadequate. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who had done this many times before. "Carlos," Miguel called out. "Over here!" Jake's heart sank as he realized Miguel was calling for help despite having a knife at his throat. The approaching men spread out in a tactical formation, clearly experienced in handling dangerous situations. "Let him go and we might let you live," called the man Jake assumed was Carlos. He was shorter than Miguel but carried himself with an authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "Can't do that," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your friend here was about to hurt an innocent woman." Carlos laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Innocent? You think any of this is about innocence? This is business, old man. Supply and demand. We supply what people demand. What people demand is freedom, not slavery," Jake shot back. "Freedom." Carlos gestured toward the vast desert surrounding them. "Look around. This whole area is our territory now. Local law enforcement is either bought off or too scared to interfere. We own this stretch of desert and everything in it." Jake realized with growing dread that Carlos might be telling the truth. The nearest sheriff's station was 40 miles away, and response times to remote areas were notoriously slow. By the time any help arrived, he would be long dead and Elena would be gone. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, Jake could hear the sound of his truck engine growing fainter as Tony and Elena made their escape. At least Elena had a chance now, which was more than she'd had 5 minutes earlier. "You cost us time and money," Carlos continued, moving closer with his weapon raised. "The woman was supposed to be at the transfer point an hour ago. Now we have to change our entire schedule because of your interference." "Good," Jake said simply. Carlos stopped advancing and tilted his head, studying Jake with curiosity. "You know you're going to die here, right? This isn't some movie where the hero rides off into the sunset. This is real life, and in real life, people like you disappear without a trace." Jake thought about Sarah, probably starting to worry about his absence. He thought about his daughter Maria, safely away at college, and how proud she had always been of her father's integrity. He thought about the life he had built on this land, the honest work of raising cattle and caring for the desert ecosystem that had sustained his family for generations. "Maybe," Jake said, "but at least I'll die knowing I did the right thing." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching from a different direction. This one was coming from the north, moving fast across the desert floor and sending up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Carlos and his men immediately shifted their attention to the new arrival, their weapons swinging toward the approaching threat. Jake used the momentary distraction to adjust his grip on Miguel and scan the area for any possible escape route. The new vehicle turned out to be a Border Patrol SUV, its distinctive green and white coloring clearly visible as it crested a small rise about half a mile away. Jake felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by fear for the safety of the agents who had no idea what they were driving into. "Border Patrol," one of Carlos's men said urgently. "What do we do?" Carlos cursed in Spanish, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time since his arrival. "They're not supposed to patrol this sector today," he said, pulling out a cell phone and frantically dialing a number. Jake listened to Carlos's half of a heated conversation conducted in rapid Spanish. From what he could understand, someone had either made a mistake about the patrol schedule or the Border Patrol had changed their route without warning. "We abort," Carlos announced after ending the call. "Leave the old man. We don't have time to deal with this." "What about Miguel?" asked one of the other men. Carlos looked at his trapped associate with cold calculation. "Miguel knew the risks when he took this job. We can't save everyone." Jake was stunned by the casual way Carlos was abandoning his own team member. It spoke to a level of ruthlessness that made him understand just how dangerous these people really were. Miguel's face had gone pale. "Carlos, you can't just leave me here." "Watch me," Carlos replied, already heading back toward his SUV with his men following. The Border Patrol vehicle was getting closer, now less than a quarter-mile away and approaching fast. Jake could see that it contained at least 2 agents, and he hoped they were prepared for what they were about to encounter. As Carlos and his men reached their SUV, Jake made a critical decision. Instead of holding Miguel as a hostage to bargain with the approaching agents, he released the man and stepped back, keeping his knife ready but no longer threatening. "Go," Jake told Miguel. "Run to your friends if you want. But know that every day you continue this work, You're destroying lives and families." Miguel rubbed his throat where the knife had pressed against his skin, looking confused by Jake's unexpected mercy. For a moment he hesitated, as if considering whether to attack Jake or flee to safety. The sound of Carlos's SUV engine starting made the decision for him. Miguel turned and ran toward the vehicle, which was already beginning to move before he reached it. He managed to jump into the back as it accelerated away, leaving a cloud of dust and the promise that this confrontation was far from over. Jake stood alone among the rocks, watching both vehicles disappear in opposite directions across the vast desert landscape, and waited for the Border Patrol agents to arrive. Agent Maria Santos was the first to emerge from the Border Patrol vehicle, her hand resting on her service weapon as she surveyed the scene. Her partner, Agent David Kim, circled around to approach from a different angle, both of them moving with the practiced caution of law enforcement officers who had learned to expect the unexpected in the remote desert borderlands. "Sir, are you injured?" Agent Santos called out as she approached Jake, who was still standing among the scattered rocks with his knife visible in his hand. Jake immediately dropped the knife and raised his hands. "I'm okay," he called back, "but we have a serious problem here." Agent Kim had spotted the tire tracks and was examining them with professional interest. "Multiple vehicles," he said to his partner. "Recent. And it looks like there was some kind of struggle here." Jake quickly explained what had happened, from finding Elena, to the confrontation with Miguel and his associates, to Tony's unexpected decision to help the woman escape. The two agents listened with growing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting more specific details about the men's appearance and the vehicles they were driving. "You said they mentioned a transfer point?" Agent Santos asked, pulling out a notebook to record Jake's statement. "About 30 miles north near the interstate. They were moving multiple women, not just Elena. This was part of a larger operation." Agent Kim was speaking into his radio, calling for backup and alerting other units to be on the lookout for Jake's stolen truck and the SUV carrying Carlos and his men. Jake could hear the urgency in his voice as he described the situation and requested additional resources. "Mr. Martinez," Agent Santos said, "we're going to need you to come with us to make a formal statement. But first we need to try to track down your truck and the woman who was with it." Jake nodded, grateful that the agents were taking the situation seriously. He had been afraid they might dismiss his story as the confused account of a rancher who had stumbled into something he didn't understand. As they prepared to leave the scene, Agent Kim's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. A highway patrol unit had spotted a pickup truck matching Jake's description at a gas station about 20 miles north of the ranch. The truck appeared to contain a Hispanic male and female, and they were requesting assistance. "That has to be Tony and Elena," Jake said with relief. The three of them piled into the Border Patrol SUV and headed toward the gas station at high speed. Jake found himself in the back seat, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past hour. The morning had started with routine fence repair and had turned into a life-threatening encounter with human traffickers. As they drove, Agent Santos explained that human trafficking had become an increasingly serious problem in the border region. Criminal organizations were using remote ranches and desert areas as waypoints in their operations, often without the knowledge or consent of the property owners. "You did the right thing," she told Jake, "but you also put yourself in extreme danger. These people don't hesitate to kill anyone who interferes with their business." Jake thought about Carlos's casual abandonment of Miguel and knew she was right. He had been lucky to survive the encounter, and even luckier that the Border Patrol had happened to be in the area. The gas station came into view, a small desert outpost that served the occasional traveler and local ranchers. Jake's truck was parked beside one of the pumps, and he could see two figures sitting inside. As the Border Patrol SUV pulled up, Tony emerged from the driver's seat with his hands raised in surrender. Elena remained in the passenger seat, appearing exhausted but unharmed. When she saw Agent Santos approaching, she began crying with what looked like relief and hope mixed together. "It's okay," Agent Santos said gently as she helped Elena out of the truck. "You're safe now. We're here to help you." Elena spoke rapidly in Spanish, telling her story to Agent Santos while Jake reunited with his truck and assessed the damage. Tony had driven it hard across rough terrain, but it appeared to be mechanically sound. Tony stood quietly beside the truck, obviously uncertain about his fate. Jake approached him cautiously, still not entirely sure whether to trust the man who had helped save Elena, but had also been part of her captivity. "Why did you help her?" Jake asked. Tony looked down at his hands, which were shaking slightly. "I have a daughter about her age," he said quietly. "Back in Honduras. I came here to make money to send home, but I never wanted to be part of something like this." "How did you get involved with these people?" "They found me when I was desperate. No papers, no job, no way to support my family. They offered good money for what they said was just transportation work. By the time I realized what I was really doing, they had threatened my family back home." Jake understood the impossible position Tony had been in, torn between survival and morality. The man had ultimately made the right choice, but Jake wondered how many others were trapped in similar situations. Agent Kim finished his radio conversation and approached the group. "We've got units converging on the transfer point you mentioned," he told Jake. "If your information is accurate, we might be able to shut down a significant part of their operation." Elena was still talking with Agent Santos, providing details about her journey and the other women who were part of the trafficking network. Jake could see the pain in her eyes as she recounted her experiences, but also a growing strength as she realized she was finally safe. "What happens to her now?" Jake asked Agent Santos. "She'll be taken to a secure facility where she can receive medical attention and counseling. Then we'll work with immigration services to determine her status and help her reconnect with any family members." "And Tony?" Agent Santos looked at the man who was still standing quietly beside the truck. "That's more complicated. He'll have to answer for his involvement in the trafficking operation, but his cooperation today will definitely be taken into consideration." Tony nodded, seeming to accept whatever consequences awaited him. "I just want to make sure Elena gets home safely," he said. "And I want to help you catch the people who forced me into this." Agent Kim's radio crackled again with an update from the units heading to the transfer point. They had arrived at the warehouse location, but it appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Evidence suggested it had been used for human trafficking, but no victims or suspects were found at the scene. "They probably had a backup plan," Agent Santos said grimly. "These organizations are usually prepared for disruptions to their operations." Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Elena was safe, and they had prevented at least one transfer, but the larger criminal network remained intact and would probably just relocate their operations to a different area. As the afternoon wore on, more law enforcement vehicles arrived at the gas station. Elena was placed in the care of specialized agents trained to work with trafficking victims, while Tony was taken into custody but treated as a cooperating witness rather than just another criminal. Jake gave his statement to multiple agencies, recounting the morning's events in detail and providing descriptions of Miguel, Carlos, and the other men involved. He also agreed to allow investigators to search his ranch for any additional evidence. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and red, Jake finally drove his truck back toward his house. Sarah would be worried sick by now, and he had a lot of explaining to do about why he was returning home 12 hours late with a truck full of investigators, and a story that sounded like something from a movie. But as he drove through the desert landscape he had known all his life, Jake realized that his understanding of his own land had changed forever. The ranch that had always represented security and isolation was now connected to a larger, darker world that he had never imagined existed so close to home. Sarah Martinez stood on the front porch of their ranch house, her arms crossed and her face etched with worry as she watched Jake's truck approach through the gathering dusk. Behind him followed a convoy of law enforcement vehicles with flashing lights that painted the desert landscape in alternating shades of red and blue. "Jake Martinez, where have you been?" Sarah called out before he had even turned off the engine. 32 years of marriage had taught her to read her husband's moods, and she could see from his posture that this wasn't a simple case of being delayed by routine ranch work. Jake climbed out of his truck slowly, feeling every one of his 52 years in his aching joints. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day's events was finally wearing off, leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened on his property. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk," he said, walking toward her with his hands outstretched in a gesture of reassurance. "I'm okay, but something happened today that's going to change things around here." Agent Santos approached the couple, introducing herself and explaining that they would need to conduct a thorough search of the ranch property for evidence related to the trafficking operation. Sarah listened with growing amazement as the agent provided a brief overview of the day's events. "You mean to tell me there were criminals using our land to transport kidnapped women?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with each word. "And my husband confronted them alone with nothing but a pocket knife?" Jake winced at the way Sarah phrased it, making his actions sound more reckless than heroic. "I couldn't just walk away, Sarah. You should have seen that girl's face. She was terrified." Sarah pulled Jake into a fierce hug, holding him tightly as if she could somehow protect him retroactively from the danger he had faced. "You could have been killed," she whispered into his shoulder. What would I have done then? Over the next several hours, their ranch became the center of a major law enforcement operation. Teams of investigators spread across the property, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to search for evidence. They discovered several areas where vehicles had been parked recently, along with discarded food containers and other signs of temporary camps. In a dry creek bed about 2 miles from where Jake had encountered the traffickers, investigators found a shallow grave containing the remains of 2 unidentified individuals. The discovery sent a chill through everyone involved in the search, confirming that the criminal organization was willing to kill anyone who posed a threat to their operations. "This changes everything," Agent Kim told Jake as they stood looking at the crime scene. "We're no longer just dealing with trafficking. This is now a murder investigation." Jake felt sick as he realized how close he had come to joining the victims in that unmarked grave. If Tony hadn't made the decision to help Elena escape, if the Border Patrol hadn't happened to be in the area, if any number of small factors had gone differently, he might never have made it home to Sarah. Later that evening, after most of the investigators had departed, Jake and Sarah sat on their porch swing watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The familiar sounds of cattle settling in for the night and coyotes calling in the distance provided a comforting backdrop to their conversation. "Are we safe here?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been haunting both of them since learning about the bodies found on their property. Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "Agent Santos thinks the organization will probably avoid this area now that law enforcement is involved, but she can't guarantee it." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Maybe we should sell the ranch. Move closer to town where there are more people around." The suggestion hit Jake like a physical blow. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded the original section during the Depression, and his father had expanded it into a successful cattle operation. The idea of abandoning it because of criminals felt like admitting defeat. "I can't do that, Sarah. This is our home. These are our roots." "Roots don't matter if you're dead, Jake." Before Jake could respond, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Agent Santos's number, which surprised him since she had left the ranch only an hour earlier. "Mr. Martinez, I have some news about Elena," Agent Santos said without preamble. "We were able to contact her family in Mexico, and they've been looking for her for 3 months. She was kidnapped while walking home from work in Tijuana." Jake felt a surge of relief knowing that Elena had family who cared about her and had been searching for her. "Will she be able to go home?" "Eventually, yes. But first she'll need medical attention and counseling to help her deal with the trauma. What you did today probably saved her life, but the psychological damage from her experience will take time to heal." Agent Santos went on to explain that Elena's testimony, combined with information provided by Tony, had helped investigators identify several other locations used by the trafficking network. Operations were being planned to raid these sites within the next 48 hours. "Tony's cooperation has been invaluable," Agent Santos continued. "He's agreed to enter witness protection in exchange for his testimony against the organization. It turns out he has detailed knowledge of their roots, safe houses, and financial operations." After ending the call, Jake shared the news with Sarah. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, processing the fact that their lives had become entangled with a criminal network that operated across international borders. "Do you think Elena will be okay?" Sarah asked eventually. "I hope so." Agent Santos said she's strong, and knowing that someone cared enough to help her escape will probably make a difference in her recovery. Sarah squeezed Jake's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Scared out of my mind, but proud. You saw someone who needed help and you didn't hesitate to act." Jake thought about the moment when he had first heard Elena's screams echoing across the desert. At the time, he had simply reacted on instinct. But now he understood that his decision to intervene had set in motion a chain of events that might prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Agent Santos said they're going to increase patrols in this area, Jake told Sarah. And they want us to report any suspicious activity, no matter how minor it might seem. What about our day-to-day life? Can we continue ranching normally? Jake looked out across the land that had shaped his identity and provided for his family. The desert looked the same as it always had under the starlight, but he knew his relationship with it had changed fundamentally. He could no longer see it as simply isolated and peaceful. It was also potentially dangerous and connected to a larger world of violence and exploitation. "We'll adapt," he said finally. "We'll be more careful, more aware of what's happening around us. But we won't let fear drive us away from the life we've built here." As if summoned by their conversation, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, moving slowly along the ranch road toward their house. Jake tensed automatically, his hand moving instinctively toward the spot where his knife usually hung on his belt. Sarah noticed his reaction and placed a calming hand on his arm. "It's probably just Agent Kim coming back for something he forgot," she said. But Jake remained, watchful until the vehicle came close enough for them to identify. It is a sheriff's department patrol car making a routine security check. The deputy waved as he passed the house, a reassuring reminder that they were no longer facing the danger alone. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Jake took one last look across his ranch. Tomorrow he would return to the normal routines of cattle ranching. But he knew that part of his attention would always be focused on the horizon, watching for signs that the peace of his desert home was once again being threatened by the darker forces that moved through the borderlands. 6 months after the confrontation that changed his life, Jake Martinez stood in the same spot where he had first heard Elena's desperate cries for help. The desert looked exactly the same, with mesquite trees swaying in the morning breeze and cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, but Jake's understanding of his world had been permanently altered. The memorial service for the 2 unidentified victims found on his property had taken place the previous week. Despite extensive investigation, authorities had been unable to determine their identities or contact their families. Jake and Sarah had felt compelled to arrange a proper burial in the local cemetery, wanting to ensure that these forgotten souls received the dignity they had been denied in death. "It's the least we could do," Sarah had said when they made the decision. "Someone loved these people, even if we'll never know who they were." The law enforcement investigation had yielded mixed results. The raids on other trafficking locations had rescued 17 women and children, all of whom were now receiving care and assistance in returning to their families or finding safe new homes. However, the leadership of Los Hermanos del Desierto had proven elusive, disappearing into the vast network of safe houses and corrupt officials that protected their operations. Carlos and Miguel remained at large, though Tony's testimony had provided enough evidence to secure federal warrants for their arrest. Agent Santos had warned Jake that these men might eventually attempt to return to the area, seeking revenge for the disruption of their operations. "They have long memories," she had cautioned during one of her regular check-ins with the Martinez family. "You may need to remain vigilant for years to come." Jake had taken her warning seriously, making significant changes to the ranch's security. Motion-activated cameras now monitored the remote areas of the property, and he carried a satellite phone in addition to his cell phone when working alone in distant sections. Most importantly, he had established regular check-in times with Sarah and never deviated from them without prior communication. The psychological impact of the encounter had affected both Jake and Sarah in unexpected ways. Sarah had developed anxiety about Jake working alone, often insisting on accompanying him on routine tasks that he had performed solo for decades. Jake, meanwhile, found himself startling at unexpected sounds and constantly scanning the horizon for potential threats. "It's normal," the counselor they had started seeing together had explained. "You've been exposed to a level of violence and danger that most people never encounter. Your minds are trying to protect you by remaining hyper-vigilant." But there had been positive developments as well. The story of Jake's intervention had spread through the local community, inspiring other ranchers to be more aware of suspicious activity on their properties. An informal network had developed, with neighbors sharing information about unusual vehicle movements and unfamiliar faces in the area. Elena had become a symbol of hope within this network. Agent Santos had kept Jake informed of her progress, reporting that she had successfully returned to Mexico and was living with her family while receiving ongoing counseling. Most remarkably, Elena had decided to become an advocate for trafficking victims, working with organizations that helped other survivors rebuild their lives. "She asked me to give you a message," Agent Santos had told Jake during her most recent visit. "She said to tell you that your courage gave her the strength to survive. She wants you to know that she thinks about what you did every day, and it helps her find the motivation to help other people." Tony had also found a new purpose in his life. After providing testimony that led to multiple arrests and convictions, he had been relocated through witness protection to a small town in Montana. According to Agent Santos, he was working on a ranch there, using his legitimate skills as a cattleman, while building a new identity far from the criminal network that had once controlled his life. He writes letters to Elena sometimes, Agent Santos had explained. They've become friends, bonded by their shared experience. He's also trying to bring his daughter from Honduras to live with him legally. The broader investigation had revealed the true scope of the trafficking network. Los Hermanos del Desierto was just one of several organizations operating in the borderlands, moving people, drugs, and money through a complex web of routes that stretched from Central America to major cities throughout the United States. Your ranch was being used as what we call a waypoint. Agent Kim had explained during one of the follow-up interviews, a temporary stop where they could rest, reorganize, and transfer victims between different transportation teams. They probably chose it because of its isolation and the fact that you and your neighbors minded your own business. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that the very qualities that had made ranch life appealing, the peace and privacy of desert living, had also made his property attractive to criminals. He wondered how many other rural families were unknowingly hosting similar operations on their land. Local law enforcement had responded to the revelations by increasing patrols and establishing better communication with rural property owners. Sheriff's deputies now made regular visits to remote ranches, not as enforcement actions but as community outreach efforts designed to build trust and gather intelligence. Jake had become an unofficial spokesman for this initiative, speaking at community meetings about the importance of reporting suspicious activity. He always emphasized that intervention should be left to trained professionals, having learned firsthand how dangerous these criminals could be. "I was lucky," he would tell audiences. "If the Border Patrol hadn't shown up when they did, if Tony hadn't decided to help Elena escape, things could have ended very differently. Don't try to be a hero. Call for help and let the experts handle it." Despite his warnings about the dangers of direct confrontation, Jake knew he would make the same choice again if faced with a similar situation. The image of Elena's terrified face was permanently burned into his memory, along with the knowledge that his decision to act had saved her life, and potentially the lives of many other victims. As he stood in the desert morning, watching his cattle graze peacefully in the distance, Jake reflected on how much his understanding of heroism had evolved. He had always thought of heroes as larger-than-life figures who performed extraordinary feats. Now he understood that heroism was often much simpler and more immediate, requiring nothing more than the willingness to act when action was needed. His cell phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, reminding him about lunch and asking for his location. Jake smiled as he typed back his coordinates, appreciating the new rhythm of communication that had developed between them. The constant check-ins might seem excessive to some people, but they provided both of them with a sense of security that had become precious. Jake climbed back into his truck and headed toward the house, where Sarah would be waiting with a hot meal and the latest news from their daughter Maria, who had changed her major to social work after learning about her father's encounter with human trafficking. Maria wanted to work with organizations that helped trafficking victims, inspired by Elena's story and her father's courage. As Jake drove across the desert landscape that had shaped his life, he carried with him the knowledge that his actions had created ripples that extended far beyond his ranch. Elena was safe and helping other survivors. Tony was building a new life and working to bring his daughter to America legally. Other ranchers were more aware of the dangers that lurked in remote areas. Law enforcement had gained valuable intelligence about criminal networks operating in the borderlands. The desert looked the same as it always had, but Jake Martinez knew that he had become part of something larger than himself, connected to a web of relationships and responsibilities that stretched across borders and cultures. It wasn't the quiet, isolated life he had once imagined, but it was a life with meaning and purpose that extended far beyond the boundaries of his ranch. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by soldiers or police officers, but by ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to act with courage and compassion. As he pulled into his driveway and saw Sarah waiting for him on the porch, Jake realized that this lesson had made him not just a better rancher, but a better man.